Welcome to DEIJ Hot Takes. My name is Daryl Sinclair, and this is the podcast where we discover the bold and transformative ideas shaping diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice work today. In this episode, we are joined by Kevin Bartlett, the founding director of the Common Ground Collaborative, the initiator of the IB Primary Years Program, co-founder of Next Frontier Inclusion, and the co-author of the ACE Protocol for the NEASC Accreditation Program. Kevin, thank you so much for making the time to join us today. If you could please share with us your DEIJ hot take that guides your work.
Daryl, and thanks for the invitation. This may sound a bit negative coming from a sort of obsessive optimist, but my hot take is a bad system will beat good people every time.
Well, we love to talk systems here, and I will be honest, we typically talk about systems through systemic change, but I feel that a look at how we should approach bad systems and consider them will be a refreshing perspective. So could you take us through what you would categorize as a bad system, why this is a hot take, and perhaps how you address this in your work?
Well, I'll segue quickly into the positive and look at good systems, but just an observation from many, many years of leading schools and organizations and being in schools. I'm in schools all the time. I'm based in a school. What I see is silos. I see silos. I see silos both at the personal level and the systemic level. So systemically, no connection between the teacher evaluation system, the PD, the curriculum, the budget, the building, etc., etc. All the functions of a school operating separately in silos. People-wise, separations between the students, the parents, the board members, the general human separation into kind of human silos. We have problems with the parents. We got to do this with the teachers. I see all these things both at the sort of operational functional level and at the human level as human ecosystems. So my work is to move from silos to systems to synthesis and symbiosis, so that every part of that human system and every element in the operating system of the school becomes one clear, connected learning ecosystem. But critically, it's a human ecosystem because it's a human business we're in. The learning business is a human business. We're Homo sapiens. We're the learning species. And yet I just don't see us optimizing the potential benefit of turning silos into systems.
Okay, so with that, the fragmented, siloed approach, which causes problems and inefficiencies with the system, what would you say is for you, where do you see this having the biggest negative impact? So when we talk about this siloing, I will say as a teacher, in my perspective, and with some of the work that I try and do, been trying to reduce that siloing effect. But from your perspective and your experience with many schools around the world, where do you see it being the most salient or the most distinct, this siloing, or where the connection is broken, where it is most important to reconnect it as a system?
Well, in a sense, I think it's broken everywhere, Daryl. There's a brilliant philosophical essay called The Fox and the Hedgehog. It comes from an old Greek poem, in fact. There are certain people who see the world as foxes. Much exciting but disparate, disconnected activity. Other people who see the world through one unifying lens. I'm definitely a hedgehog, although I have too many activities. I think the biggest negative impact is on the core business of our work, which is on learning. So what I bring to systems design is looking at the whole system through the question, if we systematized, how could we optimize the learning impact for every single learner, adult and child, within the system? So to me, the biggest negative impact is on what we do in a theory for a living, which is make learning happen. So my work is to systematize everything around learning so that learning is optimized for every kid, every teacher, every board member, every parent, etc., with every family being seen as a learning family. So the big negative impact is on learning itself, which is pretty detrimental since that's all we're supposed to work on in the end.
Yeah, it's kind of after keeping the children safe, that's the kind of the main thing we're meant to be doing. Now, we've spoken before, and there are some wonderful examples you have of schools that you've been a part of or a part of creating systems for. Is there an example that comes to mind for you, or a school that you have worked in, on, or been a part of creating the systems for, that you would use as an example of what it can look like for systems to work together in the way that you envision or you would aspire to?
There are there are several, although I'm a bit loath to name one because I work very closely with schools over long periods of time. I tend to sign 3 to 5 year partnerships. So, what if I can? What I'll do is I'll map out quickly the elements of the system I work with, and perhaps use illustrative examples of each piece from schools, if I can get my head around doing that quickly. So, we basically said, why don't schools improve? What is the human element that stops us recognizing this lack of system and tackling it? Um, I think partly it's fear. Um, and I think it's partly a fear of once you understand how connected things are, you realize that if you're a leader, Daryl, you have to play with every part of the system. And that can be overwhelming, and you can suffer from what we call the paralysis of enormity. So, what we said was if this leader, because to me, the critical element in the change is the leaders. I've realized now around schools, the schools that I work with that do brilliantly really have leaders of a certain type. And the tool I've given the leaders is not answers, but questions. Because leaders can think, I don't have all the answers, so I can't start. So, in a very compressed form, we approached designing a learning ecosystem through a system of questioning and inquiry. The questions are, what is learning? We call that define. You cannot make learning happen collectively as one culture until you've decided how it actually works. So we've defined the learning process as conceptual, competency, character. I'll use another quote because my hot take is a quotation actually from W. Edwards Deming, the guy who transformed the Japanese car industry, who created total quality management. And another thing he said I love is, if you can't describe what you're doing as a process, you don't know what you're doing. So we started by asking the question, what is learning, and defining the learning process. We then said, well, the process can't live in a vacuum. We need to decide content. Kids need to learn stuff. So our next question was, what's worth learning? And then a question which will be dear to your heart, how does everybody access learning, regardless of neurodiversity, ethnic diversity, gender diversity? So define what is learning, design what's worth learning, diversify how does everyone access learning, and then, close to your heart as a teacher, deliver. But we didn't ask how do you teach for that. We asked how do you build a learning culture in every classroom that matches the macro culture of the whole school. And then finally, the work I've done with Jay McTighe on assessment demonstrate how do we know what the kids are learning, how do we provide evidence. So we've designed a whole system around defining learning, designing learning, diversifying learning, delivering learning, demonstrating learning. Schools that have taken it to heart and done it in a very pure form, the Mind School in Ecuador, anybody who can afford a ticket to Quito, go and see what Mind are doing. They have no classrooms. They have geodesic domes in a wooded area. They have safari tents. They have a very pure form of using our learning system. It's also a very beautiful school. It's a very inclusive school. They take all kinds of learners, Daryl. Kids that have been rejected from other schools who come almost kicking and screaming, but they accept them. It's based on very simple principles of, of love and organization and humanity. We share a mission statement with them. Our mission statement for the Common Ground Collaborative is becoming human. That was designed sitting in one of their geodesic domes. The Macri
Lovely.
School in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, well-established, traditional Catholic bilingual independent school, slowly transitioning into a CGC-style learning ecosystem. Montcrest School in Toronto, very specific about their use of language. They they wordsmith every one of our ideas until it's perfectly Montcrestized, so embedded in a Canadian culture. Because I can design central systems, but everything is context, everything is culture. So I could go on listing the schools with which I'm working closely. A recent visit to Colegio Granadino in Colombia last week, setting itself up through its strategic plan to build a learning ecosystem. So, five questions that drive the system. We work in three areas: culture, curriculum, community. Actually, in that order. And those two sort of organize as 5Ds, and those three Cs sort of phase across each other. They're very interconnected. It might be a matter of how you want to choose your lens, but everyone involved. Just a final thought. Coming back from Panama, I worked with a group of students from the ages of 3 to 11 in one class on a sense of learning. What does great learning feel like and look like? I worked with parents, I worked with the board, I worked with the whole faculty and staff, admissions and marketing, the leadership team, because it's a human ecosystem. So we can think through the pieces of the operating system, but in the end, we need to build it with everybody involved. Final quotation from Margaret Wheatley: it's only a culture if everybody buys in. So you build a culture, within the culture you build systems, but they're human systems. Of course they are. Nothing operates without the people.
Really feeling the sense of the people at the heart of it all, and the way that you've spoken about getting all facets or all corners of the community, irrespective of their title or their role, involved in the process, is a very pure form, or very almost a pragmatic form of inclusion. So, hearing that, there was one point which kind of stood out to me, which I would love to go a touch deeper in. That technically two, but when we talk when you talk about systems and the system that you've described there, which will be applied in different contexts, when you speak about the importance of the leader in the creation and the enactment of this system, I think for many people within education, we think of systems and leaders as somewhat separate, perhaps the tenuous link being that the leader enforces the system. And we often talk about the system as this big bad, or sometimes this big good. We have a great system at our school. We have a bad system at our school. That will be a separate statement to: we have a great head of school. We have a bad head of school. So that kind of separation there, how do you think that affects our ability to improve and make these systems a reality?
You know, I'm always looking for simplicity. I do something called the one line job description with leaders. I ask them, if you can't use your title, what do we do for a living really in one sentence? Mine is, I try to bring clarity to complexity. So this is a kind of simple answer. It's actually echoed, if anyone knows Good to Great, the Jim Collins book, by what he calls level 5 leadership. One of the biggest qualities is humility. It really is humility. There's a difference between building an ecosystem and building an ecosystem. And what I find is that big egos get in the way of great systems, great schools. So in every school that I've mentioned, and I feel guilty because I could have mentioned some others, leaders are highly intelligent, very, very open to ideas, very good connectors of ideas. They begin to connect across ideas. In fact, what they do, what we're trying to teach kids to do centrally, conceptual transfer. Oh, so it works here as well. Yes, there are patterns here. It's a fractal. Look, every kid in this school has a zone of proximal development. Every teacher has a zone of proximal development. Every school has a zone of proximal. A leader who thinks, oh, so, and that pattern repeats here, doesn't it? So connected thinkers who put the school's growth before their own career. And teachers know that. They know what motivates a leader. So I find humble, open minded, connected thinkers and kindness, kind people. I don't think you can ever have a great school that isn't permeated by kindness. So human centered design is kind of what we use. It actually begins with empathy. Who are we empathizing with? What's the actual problem? How can we ideate a new solution? How can we test it and then fully implement it? If you start with the mission of becoming human and you use human-centered design and you find leaders who are highly intelligent but purpose-driven, driven by creating the best school for every person in it, rather than what will look good on my CV. I mean, and we kind of all know that, and it is level 5 leadership. So it's high intelligence, open-mindedness, the ability to see patterns, and low ego. Those seem to me to be, if I could describe all the leaders I work with who are successful, that's kind of the pattern.
And if I read between the lines there, so as a relationship between that leader and the systems which are being developed, that humility and that kindness is almost the ability to, dare I say, look at the system as something which is not owned by the leader, having the humility to take input from everyone to create a community, an ecosystem which everyone can exist in. So it shouldn't be the ball and chain of the leader to make it move, to make it happen. There needs to be humility. It needs to be a human-centered kindness, which actually enables that system to flourish. But the role of the leader is still critical. The role of the leader is still going to
I
push it.
think it's to bring the questions. I try to reassure, especially young leaders these days, don't think you have to have all the answers. I've mentioned this already, but bring the questions. I could define leadership as the ability to bring the right questions to the community and lead the community towards answers to which we all buy in and which we will all work to implement. And I think if you can achieve that, that full ownership of the answers to the questions I bring as a leader, how does everyone access learning in our school? How do we make sure that the full range of neurodiversity is challenged, that everyone belongs here? If you can bring the questions and mobilize the people to come up with collective answers, you're building a culture. And as Drucker said brilliantly, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So leaders who understand they are building a culture, it's only a culture if everybody buys in. Therefore, they cannot simply dictate the answers. Because if culture eats strategy for breakfast, the leader who just brings strategy will come and go. The school will not have changed in any sustainable way. And what we want is schools that don't just have golden eras. The great school has to survive that leader. So if it has to survive the leader, it's necessarily not dependent on the leader. But in this odd way, the leader is critical in bringing the right questions and building the culture. And then finding ways that the culture will sustain itself without that leader, without her or him. Because schools that are, you work in schools, schools suffer from the turnover of leadership. When the new person comes in, oh, I don't do it this way, I do it my way. And then we go all the way back to the beginning. That's why I don't think there are many great schools.
But if the school has a strong culture, that culture will eat that strategy that that new teacher brings. I will say, in the most recent leadership role that I had, that was part of my job description, was to consolidate a collective culture for the school. It wasn't to put in new systems, although that was some of the bylines of my contract as such. There would be systems underpinning it, but the headline was my primary concern was creating a culture for the school. So very much empathizing with what you're saying, and very much have personally seen some of the impacts. Now, as we approach the end here, you've said some absolutely brilliant statements and shared some wonderful quotes with us. So I hope this isn't too much of an echo, but I'd love to hear, for anyone who's listening or anyone who perhaps only sees this section, what might be one key takeaway, one pithy statement, one reflective idea, or even a resource, if it's potentially something that you have made available already, that you would want to share with people who are listening to you right now?
I have too many thoughts. One of them is somewhat self-interested, having said these are not ecosystems. There'd be a request to check out the work of the Common Ground Collaborative, because we go into schools and we intentionally deconstruct and then co-construct these cultures. So I can't resist saying, take a look at our work. Um, here's a takeaway. If you're thinking of leadership, I'm a nature guy, I'm a wildlife photographer. Go and find a beautiful tree, sit under it for an hour or so, and ask yourself these three questions. Why lead? Why should anyone be led by me? and leading towards what? And if you don't have answers to those questions, or formative, emergent answers to those questions that satisfy yourself, reconsider your motive for being a leader. So I'll just offer, since I talk about questions, I'll offer 3 questions for prospective leaders to find the core of their own purpose as a leader.
That is wonderful. And hopefully there's a lot of people listening who are going through that in their head. And hopefully there's a lot of leaders out there who have gone through similar reflective questions at some point in their career. But with all of that being said, thank you so much for spending this time with us, Kevin. For our listeners, I'm going to place links in the description where they can connect with you, where they can find the Common Ground Collaborative and explore the ideas and work that have been discussed. And to everyone, thank you for watching or listening. And I will see you on our next episode of DEIJ Hot Takes. Thank you so much, Kevin.
No, thank you, Daryl. Thanks, everybody.